All right. Good evening, folks. Good evening. My name is Dwayne Kwaysee Wright Barrington III, and it is a privilege to welcome you to the university seminar, Intersectional Masculinities. Uh, I will remind you to mute yourselves on entry. As much as we want you to be part of this conversation, not yet. We want to make sure that our speakers are not interrupted. So if you can mute yourself on entry. However, feel free to continuously throughout use the chat function, introduce yourself, tell us why you're here. If you have a particular question, if the speakers say anything that wants to resonate with you, I will say, we will have a chance at the end for audience Q&A. But for now, if everyone who is not presenting could mute themselves, we would really appreciate it. Popular opinion has said that there is a problem going on with boys and men. Whether that is true or not true, as most likely tends to happen with popular opinion tends to be dominated from an ultra-white perspective. We have seen the dominance of whiteness not just in the last couple of years, but frankly in the last couple of days, and the results of how that can result in a fascist sort of regime being swept in by something what we call democracy. However, there has to be a concentration on what is a particular problem of both boys, men, and all those that might fit in between being left out of certain conversations, being sort of isolated because of certain types of privileges, and boys and men from their own perspective not feeling as part of the democracy that we're trying to build, both that should be multicultural and multifaceted in certain instances. So what do we do with that particular problem? Well, as academics here at the George Washington University, we decided to have a discussion. So this summer, I came together with some remarkable scholars, Dr. James McMaster, Dr. Manuel Coular, Dr. Desmond Goss, and we were aided with the leadership of Dean Lionel Howard, who's the academic dean here at the Graduate School of Education and Human Development. And we came up with this idea of this university seminar, Intersectional Masculinities. The sort of concept of this seminar is right there in the word. Of course, we take the concept that started with the Black feminist sort of tradition from the Combahoney River Collective of intersectionality, the idea of one or more differing identities that were oppressed coming together to formulate a new or quite frankly, under highlighted oppressed identity. We also take this sort of concept of masculinity. Both the masculinity that might be formulated in the toxic manner, the masculinity that has been used to oppress not just women, but all types of people throughout the world, but the masculinity that all men and boys sort of hold. And we say that what is it to actually experience sort of a masculinity at the intersection of a oppressed identity, but a privileged identity as well. We do have, as we are what we call proper academics here, research questions that we would love to highlight for you. And I have just placed them in the chat. The third question was cut off, so I will put that for you back there. But these are the questions that we're going to contemplate throughout the entire sort of 12-month stretch. The seminar will have four sort of sections, and today will be the first section, which will be led by Dr. James McMaster, and I will do his introduction in a second. Two things before I turn it over to James. First, sort of ground rules for tonight, and then the format. First, ground rules. We are here to engage with scholars that have voluntarily decided to come and share their work. This is not a debate society, nor are we here to debate their views or sort of try to scream over their views with our own. GW, as a private university, reserves the right to remove anyone that we feel is attending this event for the purposes of disruption rather than for exploration. We've never had to do that. I don't anticipate doing that, but I just need to let you know that in case someone decides to come here and behave naughty, I will act accordingly. The format for tonight is as such. After I introduce our facilitator, Dr. McMaster, he will introduce the speakers. The speakers will be allotted a specific amount of time to give their perspective on tonight's topic, which again are Asian American masculinities. After that, the speakers with Dr. McMaster will engage in a facilitated conversation. That portion of it is being recorded, so if you like what you hear, we will have hopefully something edited after for you. After that, we do stop the recording, and we hope to have about 15 minutes at the end for audience engagement and Q&A. We encourage you, however, to put any questions, comments, or concerns you might have into the chat function. We will not, I say we will not be able to get to all the questions before the end of the night, but we will share all the questions with both the presenter and the facilitators. So please feel free to start engaging right away, including right now, if you do so wish. And with that, I will introduce tonight's MC, the sort of facilitator, Dr. James McMaster. Dr. McMaster is an assistant professor of American Studies and English here at GW. He is his manuscript in progress, I think submitted now, if I am correct in saying, is Racial Care, the Asian American Case, examines how 21st century Asian American artists have used aesthetic means to expose, contest, and improve their neglected position within the unjust distribution of racialized care relations that subdues everyday life and death in the United States. His interdisciplinary research program spans a range of interests, including care and social reproduction theory, Asian American theater, performance, and visual culture, imperial, state, and interpersonal violence, queer and trans Asian American subcultures, and visual, as well as abolitionist and social movements. His scholarly writing has appeared in numerous places, including the American Quarterly, the Journal of Asian American Studies, the Journal of Dramatic Theory and Criticism, and a number of edited volumes, including Unsafe Words, Queer Perspectives on Consent in the Me Too Era, with Olivia McGaon, as well as a co-editor of the Between, a couple forums performing together, a special forum of women and performance, a journal of feminist theory focusing on co-authorship and collaboration. He has also published popular writing in national and local venues, including Teen Vogue, How Round, and Vice. James, before I turn it over to you, I'll just like to say, before that this seminar was supported by several folks, and as you are kicking off the event, I will put all of our co-sponsors in the chat so our audience can see. Thank you, Mr. McMaster. Take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Dr. Wright, and for getting us all situated here. I think everybody in the room should know and understand that Dwayne has been the sort of visionary leader of our endeavor here at GW to think collaboratively about intersectional masculinities. He's just a really generous, hardworking person, one of the most hardworking people I know, and I just feel very grateful to call him a friend, colleague, and comrade. Thank you all for being here. I see a lot of friends and colleagues far and wide in the crowd. It warms my heart. Welcome to this conversation about Asian American masculinity at the cutting edge. As I sat down to figure out how to frame this conversation for you all, I struggled with the reality that there are so many ways one can enter into a conversation like the one we are about to have. One could focus the discussion, for example, on the vast range of masculinities embodied and expressed by Asian American subjects, from presidential candidates like Vivek Ramaswamy to Andrew Yang, to stars like Bowen Yang and Simu Liu, to Top Chef All-Stars like Melissa King and Kristen Kish. These conversations might lead us to think about what the performance and performativity of Asian American masculinity might have to teach us about racial neoliberalism and the collective unconscious of popular and political culture, what we are driven to consume, to receive, and how. But we could also speak in another way and at another scale about the difference masculinity might make to the transnational encounter between so-called Asia and empires, American and otherwise. What might we say, for instance, about the genres of masculinity that have spread across the world with the rise of K-pop and Korean soft power? What could we say about how the United States has historically enabled the rise of Filipino leaders like Ferdinand Marcos, Rodrigo Duterte, and Bongbong Marcos, men whose corruption cannot be disentangled from their toxic expressions of gender? And lastly, what might we say, I wonder, about the way Palestinian men are often left out of the rhetoric many of us would use to resist the ongoing genocide in Gaza? Even among those who fight for a free Palestine, the deaths of women and children seem to count more than the deaths of men, which are left to rot at the intersection of masculinity and ungrievability. This, too, it seems to me, is gender-based violence. So it's like I said, any conversation about Asian American masculinity gives us many places to go, to enter, to travel. And I am as excited as anyone to see where our brilliant speakers might take us down this road. So I'm going to introduce both of them to start off, and then they will speak one after the other. Then we'll have this conversation that Dr. Wright already described. So Takeo Rivera is assistant professor of English at Boston University, where he is also core faculty in women's gender and sexuality studies and affiliated faculty in African American and Black diaspora studies and American studies. He is the author of Model Minority Masochism, Performing Cultural Politics of Asian American Masculinity, published by Oxford University Press in 2022, which won the 2024 honorable mention for the Media Performance and Visual Studies Book Award from the Association for Asian American Studies. I give my personal recommendation that everybody should read this book. His articles have been published in such journals as Amerasia, Performance Research, Social Text, ASAP Journal, and Post 45 Contemporaries, as well as several anthologies. He is a former faculty fellow at Harvard University's Charles Warren Center and is also a playwright whose work has been staged and read in New York City, Boston, the San Francisco Bay Area, and Los Angeles. A publicly engaged scholar, Rivera has been interviewed for Al Jazeera, The Atlantic, Financial Times, Wired, NBC, and Mike, among others, on a range of subjects regarding Asian American culture and politics. Prior to attaining his PhD, Rivera worked as a rape crisis advocate, counselor, and educator in San Jose, California. Anna Storti is assistant professor of gender, sexuality, and feminist studies at Duke University, where she also teaches in the Asian American and Diaspora Studies program. She is currently at work on two book projects, one which asks what the growing population of mixed race Asian Americans elucidates about intimacy, violence, and the permanence of war, and another that spotlights the practice and cultures of vice. Her research has been supported by the McNair Scholars Program, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the Institute for Citizens and Scholars. Her scholarship has been published in Women in Performance, a journal of feminist theory, Frontiers, a journal of women's studies, Feminist Studies, Asian Diasporic Visual Cultures and the Americas, and Differences, a journal of feminist cultural studies, among other venues. And her poetry can be found in Sinister Wisdom, a multicultural, lesbian, literary, and art journal. With that, I pass the baton to you, Takeo, to get us started. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, James. That's such a brilliant introduction that I don't know if I can necessarily hit all those amazing topics and perspectives that you list, James. It's quite a provocation, and thank you for the generous introduction. Also, thank you for inviting me. Thank you to Dwayne and Tehran for putting this all together as well. So I've got a bit of a sort of a funny little talk that I wrote like sort of basically like right as the election, literally as the election was happening. And it draws partly from my book, and mostly it kind of doesn't. But it does talk about masculinity. It talks about Asian American masculinity. But, so let's talk about the elephant in the White House, right? We're likely still reeling from the horror of last week. And, nothing that I'm going to say here is going to fully address it. But it is very much being said in the context of what just happened last week. And I will say kind of off topic that, in a lot of ways, what we're facing here, we can reduce this to a matter of masculinity in terms of the election last week. But I think in many respects, like if we're to diagnose what happened, I'm of the camp that believes that the Democratic Party made a lot of considerable failures, many of them, including the ongoing arming and political cover for the Zionist state's genocide in Gaza. And I think Trump's horrific triumph is owed more than anything else to Democratic Party leadership that refused to listen to a lot of us who have been saying this. But nevertheless, Trump's success is an indication of an entrenchment of toxic masculinity in our politics, no matter which way you look at it. A transition from a military masculinism that has always been assumed to be part of the American presidency to one of outright, unapologetic, direct chauvinism. And the violence of American masculinity has been a part of the settler colonial foundations of this country, so the essence of Trump's racist hybrid masculinity is quite old. But the intensification and audacity of it does seem to represent a particular turning point. And as many news articles have pointed out, many men of color have signed on board with it, which is really interesting. So, so let's think about this from the Asian American standpoint. So I talk about this from three principal vantage points professionally. So first, as a playwright, my play Goliath, for example, is principally about the role of homophobic hypermasculinity in producing a discourse that can join sexual violence with war crimes. Secondly, as James had mentioned, I was a rape crisis advocate. So for 2 years before graduate school, I worked as a rape crisis educator, advocate, and counselor, working with sexual assault victims as well as young men to foster a male youth culture and allyship with women and queer folks against rape and violence. And thirdly, and most obviously, as an academic, and and James brought up minority masochism, which focuses particularly on the cultural logics of Asian American masculinity more broadly. So these three vantage points have informed my perspective on Asian American masculinity and masculinities of colors more broadly. And my remarks today are not from my book, but rather a sharpening of my book's conclusions after a few years of reflecting on it, and from applying the book's ideas to contemporary political conditions. So, starting from the bottom, it's a no-brainer that race and gender are not only intertwined, but mutually constitutive. Gender shapes racialization and vice versa. Race helps form gender. This has been observed at least as early as Sojourner Truth's immortal refrain of "Ain't I a woman?" But needless to say, the ideological terrain of racial capitalism affects Asian Americans as well. Again, I believe I'm stating the obvious when I mention Orientalist feminization, itself the convergence of gendering of an irreconcilable East and the indigenous virgin lands targeted by manifest destiny, ripe for European plunder and so forth. This misogynistic form of feminization has, of course, been addressed by various nationalisms of color, from Black Power and Chicano nationalism, of course, to militant Asian American cultural nationalism that emerged in the wake of the late 1960s protest movements that were foundational to the identity itself. But despite the presence of feminist artists and writers in this period, there emerged a kind of Asian American masculinism that was best epitomized by the provocative, legendary, and often maligned IE anthology. Now, of course, the IE editor, Frank Chin, widely considered the central and most abrasive figure of this period of cultural nationalist writing, has been roundly taken to task for the sexism and homophobia that inundates his work since Elaine Kim's inaugural work of Asian American literary criticism. So we see this in Chicken Coop Chinaman, we see this in Year of the Dragon, really throughout the majority of his work. And Chin's writings in particular foregrounded certain forms of cultural logics that we would today, frankly, associate with incels. And I mean that with a clear specificity to this online tendency, a very specific modality of sexism whose meaning has recently been diluted in contemporary political discourse. So, incels. Incel, if you recall, is a portmanteau for set involuntary celibate. The incel man is too undesirable to be selected as a sexual partner. The incel develops hatred in two directions. One, a self-directing masochism for being undesirable, and secondly, a misogynistic resentment towards women for being too quote unquote shallow to recognize the substance within the incel's character, so to speak. Needless to say, the incel is necessarily hypocritical, since the only women who concern them anyway are hegemonically attractive. Now, I'm a baby masochism guy, but resentment is the key ingredient that I'd like to talk about. So, when I talk about resentment, I'm building upon Wendy Brown's Nietzschean critique of liberal identity politics. And I don't mean the way that Maureen Dow is going after it, because we're talking about completely different things here. I think a lot about resentment in my book. Resentment requires a kind of melancholic consumption of hurt to continue in perpetuity in order to maintain its sense of identity coherence. I discuss how resentment politics has been deeply critical to the maintenance of Asian American identity, premised upon a rehashing of past oppression that may not necessarily even correspond to the experiences of embourgeoised post-1965 Asian American populations. And this is what Wendy Brown has called a politics of woundedness. Now, side note, I really am harping on the incel thing because the term incel has become dispersed to describe all sorts of misogynists today, when in fact it is their entitled resentment from not having sex that is key to the formulation. For example, we talk about Andrew Tate. He's been described as an incel leader, when in fact, as a sex trafficker, he represents a completely different formation of misogyny, even if what he shares in common with incels is an entitlement of sex from women. Many incels are in fact resentful of men like Andrew Tate, the men who are sexually promiscuous, and loathe women for choosing men who resemble him. So what's key here about the incel is that it's again sort of a formation of resentment. And that's something that we see deeply in common both in Trumpism and, for that matter, in Asian American cultural politics and Asian American masculinity in particular, regardless of the political spectrum. So it's in this combination of self-loathing and resentment that impels the incel towards school shootings, sexual assault, and so forth. And it was also, I should add, a principal cultural logic that operated in the killing of Vincent Chin in 1982, a well-tread event that I revisit in my book. So I'm going to talk about my book briefly. So the 1982 hate crime killing of Vincent Chin absolutely represented a politics of resentment by laid-off auto workers who blamed Japanese industries and Japanese cars for their economic woes. In early 1980s Detroit, to quote Helen Zia, Japanese cars were vandalized and their owners were shot at on the freeways, and car dealers held raffles for the honor of taking a baseball bat to a Toyota to bash to pieces. And I'm going to very briefly screen share. Give me a moment. Yep. So an early scene of Renee Tajima Pena and Christine Choice, Who Killed Vincent Chin, captures such an event. A large crowd of white Americans takes turns swinging a sledgehammer, multiple two-handed swings, against the bodies of ownerless Japanese cars. Children are present waving flags. Police officers stand nearby but do not interfere, assuming relaxed poses. The news caption reads, "Striking back." Now, striking back implies a righteous resentment, a fighting against that which has wronged them. Indeed, the news media captured by Who Killed Vincent Chin exposes a logic of resentment, a developing a moral economy equating righteousness with having a suffered injury. And under resentment, revenge is individuated upon particular objects of fury. The crowd in question is not just striking back at the economic downturn and having lost their jobs. The specific targeting of Japanese cars means that they strike back against a machine colored and exaggerated by racial logics. They strike back against a machine built by a machine-like people, a society of simulacra who can perform the American industry better than the Americans themselves. And it is a foreign machine that they rage against, rather than directing proletarian rage towards the exploitative bourgeoisie that disenfranchises them domestically. They perform the nationalist ideology that enframes the entire corporate entity, from CEO to workers, as a single unit against a foreign power. Here, in Tajima Pena's Who Killed Vincent Chin, we reveal a feedback loop between the social drama and stage drama, a choreographic spectacle of violence predicated upon the annihilation of foreign metal bodies. And it is this embodied rehearsal, the destruction of things made doubly things by virtue of racialization, their Asianness, their uncanny signification as possessing a race that heightens their threat. And in turn, the discursive logic leads equally to its inverse. The race itself is monstrous from its mechanization, from its oriental machine-like quality. But resentment has equally governed Asian American masculine affects. Just as we were victims of it, we have also been perpetrators. And to go back to Frank Chin, we need only to turn to his writings to see the parallels between the articulations of Asian American masculinity and incelism. Chin is a spokesperson for a wider tendency within Asian American straight men who believe that due to the ongoing stereotypes of Asian men being weaker, smaller, less masculine than the white standard, and then other men of color, Asian men are at a disadvantage when competing for the sexual desires of women, including, if not especially, Asian women, who are, of course, doubly oppressed by the viciousness of exotifying misogyny and racism alike. So within this Chin reminiscent incel logic, there is a Chincel logic. There is a combination of rage towards women who buy into the stereotype, especially traitorous Asian women, but also a deep self-loathing, a haunting sense that maybe the stereotypes are right, and that frustratingly, Asian men in fact embrace this emasculation. Chin and other men's militant rejection of the model minority is in fact partly driven by this fear of emasculation. While I too have a complex loathing of the model minority, Within the Asian American masculinist paradigm, the model minority doesn't just represent a kind of selling out to white American racism and embrace of anti-Blackness, but also a perversion whose fear invokes misogyny and homophobia. Opposing the model minority from an Asian American Shincel standpoint is not unlike opposing neoliberal multiculturalism from a Trumpist standpoint. The recognition that something is indeed wrong, but for the entirely wrong reasons. James, how much time do I have? Out of curiosity.
You have time.
I have time? Okay. I'm kind of like improvising a little bit here, but I wanted to sort of briefly talk about off script for a minute. I want to talk a little bit about another part of my book where I discuss the Incredible Hulk because oops, a second here. My silly. Okay. So in my book, I talk in my fourth chapter of my book, I discuss the Incredible Hulk as written by Korean American comic author Greg Pak. And in this section of the book, I basically make the argument that Greg Pak utilizes the Hulk as a metaphor for Asian American masculine resentment politics, because the Hulk, as I think most people are familiar, is a superhero whose strength is directly proportional to the amount in which he's angry. So in a lot of ways, his strength and his size corresponds directly to his resentment, but what happens is over time is that he's able to find more forms of liberation, and it's sort of a deeper liberatory politics by not by surrendering away from resentment and towards a form of masochism that is indeed self-critical and open to solidarity. And we see this a little bit later in his embrace of what we call, embrace of what we call the spikes. And these are sort of like alien creatures who feed on him and make him basically send him more and more anger and pain, but in doing so allows the creatures to feed and grow and regain their strength after being starved for so long. So in a lot of ways, here we have the turn from resentment to masochism, in which the Hulk is in fact, by basically being a queerer figure, being open to penetrability, that we see a reconfiguration of Asian American masculinity. So this is sort of like my brief moment of utopianism in the book. Anyway, so that's a bit of an aside. But back to the talk. So if you see, the politics of resentment can take on a deeply misogynistic form. It is not necessarily always immediately so, but it frequently is. But it's worth considering that resentment politics is, of course, characteristic of far-right tendencies, that it is characteristic of far-right tendencies, even if it is also the starting point of left-wing ones. So since 2015, Donald Trump has become the candidate of white masculine resentment. And this is so obvious, it barely requires explication. Make America Great Again is not only nostalgic, but vengeful, angry at the supposed injustice of outsiders, immigrants, Mexicans, Muslims, the radical left, wokeness for stealing an American way of life, or stealing an election for that matter. Although we should correctly point out the white supremacy of this logic, the sense of hurt and dispossession as a consequence of global neoliberalism is valid but misattributed. It is not immigrants or other supposed elements of an American way of life that is causing a sense of decline, but the ongoing plastic cruelty of global capitalism, of which Trump himself is obviously an avid profiteer. But through the incredible alchemy of American racist ideology, class war becomes transformed into culture war, and racially and sexually othered members of the working class become scapegoated targets of Trumpist ire. The January 6th insurrectionists were, after all, driven by shared grievance, a sense that they were the oppressed minority. Trump of 2024 openly threatens punishing his political opponents. But there's also no greater embodiment of the horrors of the politics of resentment than the Zionist entity known as Israel. And since the Nakba of 1948, a campaign of ethnic cleansing and dispossession of Palestinians that has never ended, that has reached its horrific apotheosis in the aftermath of the Hamas uprising on October 7th, 2023, Israel has claimed an existential victimhood and correspondingly utilizes and weaponizes this victimhood to fuel its resentful genocide. This very real and horrifying history of anti-Semitism has become weaponized again and again to commit unceasing atrocities since the start of the Nakba. Tens of thousands of children and men and women murdered in a year, entire families deliberately targeted and wiped out by Israeli drones. One of these AI programs being called Where's Daddy, for example. And while Trump is the most blatant peddler of resentment, Harris and Biden have also been enablers, with Harris repeating disproven IDF claims of Hamas mass rape anytime she was confronted about the genocide. The Biden-Harris administration has provided political cover for these actions for a year, vetoing ceasefire resolution after ceasefire resolution, continuing to send enormous packages of weaponry even when presented evidence of Israel's mass starvation campaign. Asian American complicity in the genocide, from Harris herself to the ADL's involvement in the Asian American Foundation and the JACL, reflects perhaps a mutual affinity with the politics of resentment. Moreover, it's worth considering how Kamala Harris herself felt compelled to cater to toxic masculinity embedded into American empire itself. Rather than lean into a Black feminist tradition of anti-imperialism, Kamala oftentimes felt the need to perform a military masculinity, bragging about the lethality of American military in her pantsuits. Kamala Harris, despite being a cishet woman, herself embraced a kind of model minoritarian masculinity, one that completely embraced American exceptionalism and assimilationism, fervently refusing to engage with her Indianness and Asianness throughout her campaign. So some Asian Americans voted for Trump, but also some Palestinians and Arabs voted for Trump, which seems absurd at first glance until you realize that Trump's repulsiveness, including his toxic masculinity, is in fact key to his appeal. He's the living embodiment of resentment and has capitalized upon this appeal to folks who would normally be politically horrified by him. And some of these resentments are steeped in misogyny and racism. Some other resentments are desperate and legitimate. And the Democratic Party's refusal to acknowledge the latter is a big reason why we're in this fascist situation we're in today. The centralization of Asian Americans as victims in a narrative of racial justice, as another corollary, has gone from an important moment of awakening and collective empowerment to a reactionary defense of institutional anti-Blackness. And insofar as resentment remains focused on one's injury, rather than turning outward, that is, resentment remains individuated rather than converting into solidarity, then its otherwise revolutionary potential becomes perverted into an exact opposite. This, I suppose, is my main point. I'm putting my thesis statement at the end. Resentment remains reactionary and masculine in nature, a fear of being shamed. Solidarity, meanwhile, is feminist. It demands shared vulnerability in building common justice. I paraphrase my old friend, Jewish American activist Amanda Galender, who said that something to the effect that the most Jewish thing one can do is resist genocide. That never again does not mean never again to us, but never again to anyone. Never again to us is resentment. Never again to anyone is solidarity. And therein lies the problem with the resentment and by extension, racialized toxic masculinity. So I guess at the end of the day, I'm kind of a masculinity pacifist. But suffice to say that Asian American needs a reckoning with its legacies of hypermasculinity and resentment. And even if it emerges from an anti-model minority impulse, such resentment can loop back around and buttress the very violence of racial capitalism that initially inspired it. Thank you very much.
Takeo, that was awesome. Your words on resentment are so clarifying, and I'm really excited for the conversation. I'll just begin with some thanks. Thanks to James for the introduction, the invitation, and the foresight for planning this event at this time when not much feels better than just being together. And because so much goes into the coordination of these events, my gratitude goes to Dwayne Wright and all at GW who helped make this possible. I'd also just like to drop a link into the chat of the artwork that I'm using as my background. This is from Entangled Roots, and they have a lot of great, beautiful work on the site that I hope you can support if you're able to. So like many of us, I am doing the best I can right now. And much of that has to do with the events of last week, which I find myself reflecting on the past decade and how much has changed, how much has not. So in my talk, I'm going to ask you to kind of join me in thinking back across the past decade, particularly finding yourself in the year of 2014 to 2015, when a series of cases emerged that would unsettle feminists and the public alike. These cases involve, and thus I will be discussing sexual violence, gun violence, racism, misogyny, and in a way, I'll only be scratching the surface of this thing called the apocalypse. And I look forward to the Q&A. A crude and vexing question appears on a promotional image for the now defunct halfasian.org. Sweet and sour white power. Why are there so many white nationalists, alt-rightist, and racists with Asian wives and children? Facetious, rash, and hastily thrown together, the image seeks to provoke. Posted in 2017 by an account since deleted, the collage includes stills of Asian and white people collaborating in far-right YouTube videos, Asian people raising their arms in the Nazi salute, Asian women wearing MAGA hats, and an Asian woman sitting alongside a white man as they hold rifles with the flag of Nazi Germany displayed behind them. Pictured alongside their Asian wives and mixed children are two white men smiling, who epitomize the sentiment behind one commenter's response to the post. WMAF, white male, Asian female, the official relationship of the alt-right. So one of these white guys is the defamed journalist known for his anti-Black comments following the murder of Trayvon Martin, in which he advised white people and East Asians to protect themselves and their children by avoiding Black people altogether. Another white guy is the founder of the Fraternal Order of the Alt-Knights, a paramilitary group associated with the Proud Boys. So using such cases as evidence, the sweet and sour white power image makes a claim for assessing the implications and dangers for what seems to be an unusual romantic detour for white supremacists, which is intimacy with Asian women. But digging deeper into the depths of Reddit, as I find myself doing, which I don't necessarily recommend, but it has produced some research, so here we are. So one is soon to find a post made by Eurasian Tiger, the once infamous moderator of the subreddit Papas. On that blog, Eurasian Tiger reflects on the uptick in violence committed by Asian men with white fathers, blaming the hateful dynamic of white men and Asian women for creating a growing demographic of Hapa children who, in his eyes, are destined to incite the apocalypse, a joining of the words apocalypse and Hapa, which is an indigenous Hawaiian term that means half, and kind of predates Wasian as an identification for some mixed Asians. A generational shift and byproduct of interracial relationships, the apocalypse anticipates that more and more Asian Americans with white heritage will commit abhorrent acts of violence. Tenda Conrad Spencer, the user behind the username Eurasian Tiger, bases his theory on a specific set of racial tensions he believes mixed Asian and white children are exposed to at a developmental age. Their Asian mother's supposed emasculation of Asian men and their white father's fetishization of Asian women. So needless to say, there are many assumptions which cloud the plausibility of his theory. Not all mixed Asians have Asian mothers and white fathers. Not all interracial couples are heterosexual or even part of the alt-right for that matter. And yet the theory of the apocalypse amassed attention across Reddit and forums for mixed race people, interracial couples, MR Asians, incels, and others involved in the manosphere. So a few years after Eurasian Tiger's initial post, kind of like proclaiming the apocalypse, a fictionalized movie poster began circulating on Reddit. In a rather riveting interpretation of Spencer's theory, the parody poster resembles the patchwork of the sweet and sour image, a photoshopped version of Francis Ford Coppola's Vietnam War film, Apocalypse Now. The image incorporates Wasians who are thought to represent the apocalypse. So within the image, you'll find the faces of Alex Buckner, who is a Phoenix man who killed his parents, two sisters, and set their house on fire. Matthew DeGrood, a killer of 5 students at a house party in Calgary. Daniel Derbyshire, the son of the far-right journalist who I had mentioned. Daniel Holtzclaw, currently serving a 263-year prison sentence for assaulting more than 12 Black women as a cop. You also see Hannah Poison Ivy, a woman who allegedly used social media to lure men to degrade and kill themselves. Crit McLean, a model who shut down Times Square when he publicly stripped and danced naked during a manic episode. Elliot Rodger, the racist misogynist whose 2014 killings in Isla Vista, California made incel a household term. And then Emma Solkovich, the acclaimed artist and activist who carried a mattress similar to the one they were raped on across the Columbia campus in a durational performance. So there's a lot of like examples and cases here, but at the same time, it's a relatively small sample size. So the apocalypse may seem hyperbolic. The inclusion of Solkovich, the lone survivor in a sea of perpetrators, may also raise questions as to what counts as apocalyptic. Asian femininity lingers as a wedge in the production of the conditions that the apocalypse seems to name. But to be clear, despite the presence of Solkovich and Poison Ivy on the parody poster, the apocalypse names a specific problem of Asian white masculinity. Putting the apocalypse within a larger context of American imperialism, one can begin to tease out the imperial tensions of Asian masculinity, Asian emasculation, and even sexual predation that undergird such paranoid reading. So what I think is perhaps the most crucial detail on the photograph, on the Photoshop poster, is the tagline, which reads, 40 years after the Vietnam War, ... It's a different kind of apocalypse. So 4 decades after the supposed end of the Vietnam War would be 2015, the twilight of the millennium, a transitional moment. The apocalypse names a speculative present born from the not so distant past, a phenomenon one could debate as real or exaggerated, but which nonetheless encapsulates the latest collection of movements against sexual violence, the approaching multiracial majority, as well as the ongoing legacies of sexualized war crimes in Asia and the Pacific. For all its insinuations about the mixed-race child born from a white father and Asian mother, the apocalypse opens up conceptual space to interrogate Asian American masculinity beyond the scopes of its queer potentials, reworking what David Ng and Nguyen Thanh Hong have respectively described as racial castration and bottomhood. Perceived as emasculated and feminized, Asian American masculinity indeed can possess a queer potential where masculinity may be dismantled and rescripted towards less cishet and patriarchal means. But in contrast to queer world making, what the apocalypse suggests is that Asian American masculinity may also function to uphold white supremacy through repeated acts of world breaking or life ending, where the Asian white subject doubles down on the racist and misogynistic logics of American subjectivity. So in titling this talk in question form, I seek not necessarily to confirm or contest the validity of such an idea, but to interrogate it, confronting the racialized anxiety that an intensifying subculture of Asian Americans with white heritage, of which I am, is imminent. So in the time that remains, let's see how 2 cases, so that of Holtzclaw and of Rodger, measure up to Spencer's theory. The verdict of the state of Oklahoma versus Daniel K. Holtzclaw is available online, and the recording went viral. So in this video that we're watching now, Officer Holtzclaw is sentenced to serve 263 years for his serial sexual assault against Black women. He's seated in between his defense attorneys and is very visibly nervous. While his trial occurred as Blue Lives Matter emerged in response to Black Lives Matter, his case, by and large, received scattered media attention. When it did reach headlines, coverage was rife with error, exposing an irregularity in which Holtzclaw was racialized, including, but not limited to, white cop, technically half-white, biracial, and the unraced rapist cop. So we see that Daniel Holtzclaw is crying because he's hearing the kind of guilty verdicts come through. So depending on the publication, writers described Holtzclaw as an all-American good guy, a monster, a scapegoat, or the poster child for police brutality. Somehow he's able to traverse the spectrum of race and decency. Does accuracy matter here? Some may argue that it does not. A rapist cop is a rapist cop. Others may refuse life details about a perpetrator altogether. As aligned as I am with commitments to center the survivors or victims in cases of sexual assault, I wonder too if there is anything we forfeit when we fail to acknowledge the perpetrator. Without humanizing, recovering, or exonerating Holtzclaw, could there be value in pulling details of his case into the center of conversation? By letting those details linger at the wayside of cultural discourse, have we lost an opportunity to further contextualize his anti-Black violence as paradigmatic of cis-heteropatriarchy and empire? By not confronting the rapist, in other words, are we relinquishing a deeper understanding of the expanse of sexual violence by simply staying true to our ethics of standing with and believing in survivors? So, born in Guam, Holtzclaw is the son of a Japanese mother, Kimiko, and German-American father, Eric. The two met in 1980 when Eric was stationed in Japan as a member of the US Air Force. At the time, Kimiko worked as a civilian police officer. After she immigrated to the United States, the Holtzclaws resettled in Enid, Oklahoma, a suburb about 100 miles north of Oklahoma City. Eric became a lieutenant with the police department, and Kimiko stayed home with their son and two daughters. As a high school student, Daniel was a hometown hero, an all-state linebacker who received a full Wright scholarship to play Division I football at Eastern Michigan University, where he graduated with a Bachelor's of Science in Criminal Justice. Eyes set on making it to the NFL, his failure on draft day spurred an anticlimactic return to Oklahoma City, where he put his degree to work and trained to become a cop. To confront a rapist like Holtzclaw necessitates an interrogation of the linkages between empire, whiteness, and masculinity, and the specificities of his connection to the sexually violent histories of military occupation and policing. For a German American to be stationed in Japan, a former empire that forced women and girls into sexual slavery, for that man to marry a Japanese woman, conjuring an imperial history of war brides, and for the couple to give birth to their son in Guam, in an unincorporated territory of the US, there is no dearth of examples insinuating the Holtzclaw family's entanglements with empire's unceasing presence. Deepening a familial legacy of state-sponsored violence, Holtzclaw was well into his third year on the job when the accusations against him began in June 2014. So the morning after the first accusation, Holtzclaw found himself in an interrogation room where he utilized a buffer non-Black people of color often exploit. When asked if he has ever slept with a Black woman or if he has a particular type, he says that he isn't discriminatory. So he's essentially believing that he is non-racist by association, using his Japanese identity as an alibi. Claiming that he is not, quote, preferential to anything, Holtzclaw suggests that his mixed heritage prevents him from acting in racist ways. But just the opposite, what he demonstrates is his people of color blindness. Jared Sexton's term detailing the consequence when one, quote, misunderstands the specificity of anti-Blackness, end quote. Once the detectives found out that Holtzclaw was Asian, the subject of conversation took a strange turn. Who's Japanese, your mom or dad? My mom. Is your dad huge? No. How'd you get so big? That's what everyone asked me, and that's why I thought, because I mean, Asian genes are kind of small. That's why I thought I was adopted at first when I talked to them, but my dad's small, 5'9". Japanese people are small in general, so. Again, Holtzclaw is a football player. He's 6'2", 260 pounds. So in the context of an interrogation for an alleged sexual assault, it's not outlandish to discuss a perpetrator's capacity for physical force. But the fixation on Holtzclaw's body is in direct relation to his Asianness. And Holtzclaw plays along. He acknowledges his mother's Asian heritage and his father's average height, constructing himself as an exceptional figure of trans-Pacific encounter in Asian masculinity. His is an Asian masculinity that is as unemasculated as it is carceral and imperial, invoking a masochistic interpretation of the model minority, which Takeo Rivera argues can be understood through the complementing frames of self-subjugation and self-flagellation. Avoiding further discussion about his racialized gender, Holtzclaw retorts with a curious assertion. Japanese people are small in general, so. Begging the question, so what? So, as uttered by Holtzclaw, is not simply a filler word, but a conjunction revealing the speaker's own inability to chronicle the global and imperial ties that made his body. It is a racial ineptitude that Grace Kyung-Wong Hong might articulate as, quote, the trace or residue of that which can never be fully erased, yet cannot speak. Whiteness materializes and has recourse in the racial conditioning of racial capitalism's racialized labor force. Part and parcel of his work as a cop, Holtzclaw has been hailed and conditioned by policing's history and the establishment of slave patrols, in addition to its continued function as a system of dehumanization. That he is the lone son in a proud family of armed service members only compels his violence to take on a reproductive and imperial logic. Tethered to systems which profess the use of mass violence, sexual violence, and psychological terror against racially subjugated communities, Holtzclaw becomes an ideal actor to perform and augment whiteness, even and especially as his racial ambiguity lingers out of frame. Just as Holtzclaw was trained to serve and protect, he was not trained to thoroughly contend with his histories, particularly the social significance ascribed to his mixed race, including, but not limited to, the US imperial battleground within which his parents met. And like Holtzclaw, Elliot Rodger is notorious for violent misogyny, but unlike Holtzclaw, whose Asian masculinity carries a muscular build, Rodger loathed what his race did to his gender. Consider his final YouTube video, uploaded minutes before he killed 7 people, including himself, injuring 14 in the process in May 2014. The video shows Rodger sitting in the driver's seat of his BMW 3 Series coupe, pompous and unwavering, as he announces the imminent day of retribution. A 22-year-old Rodger self-identifies as a kissless virgin who desperately desires sex and a blonde girlfriend. In Rodger's eyes, the objects of his desire view him as unworthy. But in the incel community, he's referred to as a saint and the supreme gentleman. In incel forums, it's common to see references to ER, his initials, and mass violence perpetrated by incels is regularly referred to as going ER. So clearly, Rodger is not alone in his motive to abolish sex and punish women, enacting revenge against humanity. One needs only to read the first few pages of his 137-page manifesto to realize that his hatred of women stems from the racial interior, where a revulsion of his Asianness engendered a deadly envy. Rodger could not fathom how other men seduced white women while he was still suffering as a lonely virgin. Being half Asian in Rodger's eyes put him at a disadvantage of scoring the blonde women he desired, but still, Rodger positioned himself as superior to other men of color. So Rodger was born in London and spent the first 5 years of his life in the UK before settling with his family in Southern California. During his early years, he embarked on a number of international trips and movie premieres with his filmmaker father. He boasted in his manifesto about his luxurious taste and lifestyle. At age 7, his favorite food was lobster. So he felt destined, or at least deserving, of these pleasures. And like Holtzclaw's generational intimacy with US empire and state-sanctioned violence, Rodger, too, carries forth an ancestral familiarity with historical violence. Rodger was, after all, the grandson of renowned photojournalist George Rodger, who is famous for his work in Africa and of capturing images of mass death during the Holocaust at the end of the Second World War. Like the genocidal campaign his grandfather bore witness to, Eliot's massacre hinged on his deeper desire to become a dictator, enacting a war on women. In his world, sexuality would not exist. In our world, his presence lurks in plain sight. His case was the impetus of the #NotAllMen and subsequent Yes All Women trends on Twitter, as well as a driving force behind his status as an incel hero. With his face on the apocalypse poster, was Rodger the opening act in a drawn-out Eurasian uprising? Could his massacre and its legacy foreshadow an intensifying subculture of those born to Asian mothers and white fathers, including the kids of J.D. Vance and Osha Vance? So weeks after the event, Eliot's father spoke to Barbara Walters on ABC 2020. It was the first time a parent of a mass murderer spoke on television. Beyond expressing parental guilt, Peter had hoped to share the warning signs he had missed as he advocated for improvements in the mental health care system. Sharing that Eliot was in therapy since the age of 7, Peter insists that his son, while a great liar, was far from evil, suffering instead from an inbred hatred. And Peter, during the ABC 2020 special reads that this is the American horror story, when you have somebody who on the outside is one thing and on the inside is something completely different, and you don't see it. So why do things have to be this way? This question belongs to Roger and is posed on the last page of his manifesto. Whether the apocalypse Christians some sort of irreversible shift, branding all WMAF couples and their mixed race children as inherently dangerous, harmful, fetishistic, or beyond repair is up for debate. What seems certain, though, is that the apocalypse is a manifestation of racial feeling, a racialized and sexualized antagonism, naming the ways whiteness and masculinity have recourse in the racial subjection of Asian Americans with white heritage. Is the Asian white subject the harbinger of the end of the world? Or is empire's subject striking back? The answer relies, of course, on the details of each individual case and whether or not a feminist outlier like Sulkovich or even Chanel Miller is enough to counter the emerging forms of violence indicative of the apocalypse. Burdened by norms and expectation, racialized gender can be a site of pain, pleasure, and refusal. Susceptible to emasculation or hypersexualization, erasure, or an assumed subservience, the Asianness of Asian white life can be recast as defunct, less than. Palatability comes at a cost. Whiteness is an advantage no matter its form or dosage. While this logic applies across all forms of Asian white life, specific discriminations of objectification, emasculation, misgendering, and gender policing unveil nuances across feminine, masculine, androgynous, trans, cis, and non-binary life. In the face of difference, one constant, a life marked by imperialism. Empire sets off glaring and destructive reverberations from intergenerational trauma and the assault on refugee life to the military's culpability in environmental disaster. It also resonates in the logics of whiteness and masculinity, which form the basis of racialized anxieties like yellow peril and Asian emasculation, anxieties which reside at the heart of the apocalypse theory and its paranoid essentialism. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, actually. Thank you both for such brilliant and provocative presentations, talks. I have a thought in response that I've scrounged together through your brilliant words. It's a question, and then I don't want to take too much time for me. I definitely want to hear you talk to each other, and I also want to be able to open out to the audience. So my question is about, Anna, what you just called racial feeling, right? And I think we're operating as we talk about incels and that particular genre of masculinity in these categories of racial feeling, and a number of have been thrown out. So Takeo, of course, you're offering us resentment sort of through Nietzsche, through Wendy Brown. But Anna, I also heard you characterize Roger and sort of his expressions of self in the manifesto as envious. And those are very closely taxonomized as affective categories, but there is a difference. And I wonder what's at stake in theorizing this kind of masculinity through each of those categories. And I would add to the list something that you invoked, Takeo, which is, this category of melancholia, thinking, of course, of like all the discourses of racial melancholia in Asian American studies, but also for me, thinking about the way that Judith Butler talks about heterosexual melancholia, right? The sort of mourning in advance of the possibility of a queerness that a straight person could never experience, right? And that being something that's sort of at the root of homophobia, at least for Butler, and gender trouble. Right. And that so the one question I have is about racial feeling and what's differently at stake in taxonomizing the sort of affective life of the incel differently with those terms. And then the second question I have is I'm sort of really struck, Takeo, when you said you're sort of a masculinity pessimist. And like one question I have is like, what is that? What do we actually mean by that? Like I'm sort of like, let's theorize that term. But then also I'm like, how much of this, I'm thinking about Jane Ward's book, The Tragedy of Heterosexuality. I'm thinking about the Kamala campaign strategy of like telling women that they should vote whoever they want, but like don't tell their husbands, and like that way they'll be safe and it'll be okay. Their vote's a secret. And the question that sort of comes out of all of this is like, how much of this is about heterosexuality, and certainly thinking about the apocalypse. It's reproduction. It's heterosexual reproduction that is producing, the case studies that you're taking up. And if some of it is reducible to heterosexuality, sort of just where do we fit queerness? What is the force of queerness in this conversation? So there's that question about racial feeling, and then there's this question about heterosexuality and queerness and their relationship as we think about what Asian American masculinity is.
First of all, I want to say I'm still kind of reeling from Anna's talk because it was just so spectacular. And there's a lot to process there. But I think in terms of the question of envy, to bring that up, I think, it was like CN9, I think, who brought up the like distinction between resentment and envy. And that what's interesting about envy is like it's kind of openly petty, whereas resentment is not. Like resentment kind of like assumes a kind of moral superiority and gains it produces a kind of moral economy in a way that envy does not necessarily. But I think what's interesting, right, about incels, right, is that they find themselves in this sort of self-hating economy while at the same time gaining a certain degree of resentful moral strength at the same time. It's sort of like this like ambivalence sort of situated in between. But this is all absolutely operating within a heterosexist logic, right? Like and and Anna brought up Nguyen Tan Huang and David Ng's work and thinking about how queer masculinities can upend that, right? It can upend those logics to a certain extent. I guess part of the reason why I sort of say masculinity pessimism is that I still wonder to what extent masculinity is actually the valuable rallying point upon which a liberatory politics sort of takes root, even if it is queer, right? And I think, and to a certain extent, right, like masculinity is most potentially liberatory when it is most removed from what it is conventionally understood as, right? So I guess so. A lot of it is it's not so much that I'm not necessarily I mean I'm cishet myself, right? I'm not a I can't be genuinely misandrous, but I think that but I'm nevertheless uncertain if whether or not masculinity is itself the social construction upon which I'm not even sure if it's necessarily worth recovering, I suppose, right? I guess we see that sort of debate happening within whiteness studies, right? Just like should whiteness be reformed or abolished? And I think and I think that within whiteness studies the general liberatory consensus is towards abolition of whiteness. But so I feel like to a certain extent a similar way about masculinity, even in its sort of queerer forms. But I'm still kind of dealing with it. I'm still kind of trying to figure that out.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny. I love the pessimism as well. And I feel it a lot, even within, I think, this kind of impetus to want to recover masculinity, to want to recover whiteness, to want to recover the categories that are so oftentimes the ones that wield the power and thus are kind of beyond repair. But yet there is this, persistent urge to kind of think through whether or not it's a queer urge or not. I mean, something I heard about recently is tonic masculinity as opposed to toxic masculinity, like it's a healing masculinity. And I think that there's a lot of these kinds of formations that speak towards this desire to repair, which is a desire that, I think is about what healing could offer, is about what we can understand as part of wellness and survival. But at the same time, these desires are so burdened by the wellness industry and the way that we're taught and trained how to understand what health is in these moments. And so healing isn't so simple as making sure you drink your water and you go to therapy, once in a while. Like it doesn't necessarily kind of heal you from all the wounds of the past. So what does it mean to come in contact with that? And so I think this question about racial healing is so interesting or racial feeling is so interesting because at least for the work that I'm kind of trying to do with Holtzclaw and Roger, which is work that actually puts Daniel Holtzclaw in conversation with Emma Sulkovich and then puts Chanel Miller in conversation with Elliot Rodger, because Chanel Miller was actually a senior when Elliot Rodger went on his rampage in Isla Vista. So she actually talks in her memoir, Know My Name, about that encounter. And so the feelings that arise there for me are oftentimes about grievance, victimhood. I mean, obviously, when you think about survivors of sexual violence, there is like clear, ways that one encounters the depths of victimhood and what that means to think about the public life of it, the private life of it. But at the same time, Holtzclaw feels grievanced. He feels wronged. He felt like his Japanese identity should have been enough to prove that he would never do anything like this. He feels like he was a poster child because he was not maybe white enough. He was the one who was put away when so many cops get off. So it's that kind of like, the Peter Liang kind of like notion of what it means to think about Asian Americanness in light of the, criminal justice system. What does that mean for us? But at the same time, Roger feels incredibly grievanced, feels like he was victimized because of his Asian masculinity. So I think the question is like, it's so hard because we know, if you take a gender studies class, you take an ethnic studies class, you know that like race and gender aren't real, but they're incredibly real. And so if we can somehow apply that logic, it might lead us to think through, why do we have to retain these categories of femininity and masculinity, categories with immense amounts of pain and baggage, but that also provide beautiful moments of, like rehearsing different ways of living life. So I think it's I'm really excited to see and hear more about how is it like a seminar about how intersectional masculinities is going? Because I think it's such an important conversation to hold the nuances across gendered life, but also racialized life, and to interject through that avenue of feeling, avenue of affect only kind of like brings a lot more vibrancy to it.